Well, good evening, listeners. It's evening for me, and it is morning of the next day for Markus Zusak, who is on the other side of the camera here. And for those listening, he's the interview guest today. I say it every time, but it always fascinates me how people can either be behind you in a day you already did, or already ahead in another day that you haven't done yet. And I just think that's so cool how that works. So he's going to look way more energetic and ready, and I'm going to look more tired because it's nighttime here. Because I'm older, being 26, I still, bedtime comes earlier these days. But I'm so excited to have him because he's the author of one of my favorite books, The Book Thief, which I'm sure he's heard many times, but it was a very impactful and has been a very impactful book for me. And it's actually a book that I've kept on my shelf for whenever I have kids, um, Lord willing, because I really want them to. I think it has a very interesting perspective on life, and I think it gives. It talks about death and things and topics that I think kids wrestle with but have no outlet to talk about. And so I would love to hopefully have them read it whenever that right time comes and talk with them about it because it was very helpful for me in thinking through the concept and um, having almost just a good conversation about serious subjects. But anyway, he's written several other books, one being The Messenger. I think he's written, if I'm right, 6 fictional. And then there's the 7th that was non-fictional about 3 dogs, right? Your dogs?
Mm-hmm.
Am I right there?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Um, and so I did want to ask you, first of all, thank you for doing this, as I know you're so busy. And two, you have written your books. It's interesting because most authors, I guess a lot of them, I don't want to say all, but seem to come out with books very quickly. Like every 2 years, every 3 years, they have this, they have to do it. Um, and for you, seems to be very much as you are inspired and as you think right. And I think you say also on your website, which struck me, that there's so many ideas that have been written about, and so you just want to write when you think there's something important to say. You don't want to just keep writing for to fill up space. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how did you form that idea to you that, you didn't want to be pressured by time and coming out with something a certain amount of time? Um, like, how did you come up with that motto? Like, how is that important to you as opposed to, well, I want to make sure I'm always out there, so every 2 years a new book's going to come out.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's so much an idea of me needing to have something to say about something. It's more, I think it just takes me that long to get something right.
Hmm.
And if it takes 13 years in the case of one book, well, then it takes 13 years. And I do have regrets about the amount of time it takes me to write a book sometimes, but not enough to make me wish I'd have done it in 2 or 3 years and then it not be what I wanted it to be. And so I think then there's that idea of there are already so many great, well, like books in the world, but then already so many great books. It's sort of like thinking to myself, well, don't add to that if it's not going to be the absolute best that you can do.
Hmm.
And and I think I've found writing harder as time's gone on. It's a little bit like it's a bit like experience. You think it should make things easier, but I think sometimes the more you know, the harder things become. Because when you're when you're writing your first books and you have no idea what you're doing, it's definitely harder on a day-to-day basis because you're not sure if you can do it. You're not sure if you've got the legs, so to
Yeah.
speak, to run the distance. And but then I think there's a bit of a sweet spot where you're still quite naive, but you do know how to do it, and then that's when your output is probably at its best. And I mean, I have friends, other writers who do put out a book a year or every second year or 2 books every 3 years or something like that. But I just can't seem to figure that out. And I think I always look at songwriters like, someone like Bob Dylan, who it's almost like an extension of breathing, is writing songs. And for me, it's not really like that. For me, I feel like I go into a sort of training phase. It's like there's a training camp, and then I get myself together, and then I
Hmm.
go to this effort to write a book. And it is like running a marathon, and then I recover and then come to terms with the idea of being at least slightly unemployed, and then I go again. So I think it's just how I do things, and I wouldn't say I get distracted, or that I'm finding other things to do. I'm not really a huge procrastinator, but I find I do pay attention to family, and to a lot of other things as well that are really important to me, and that's kind of what fills up the well to get writing again. I
Hmm.
kind of need not human contact, but I'm very aware of my responsibilities on a day to day life, with family and other things as well.
Well, I was gonna say, it's interesting you say that because most of the authors I have interviewed, um, I don't want to say they make it sound easy, but they do by extension of how they talk about it. They love what they do. They've written so many books and they just, ideas flow. And like I remember talking, to Lois Lowry or Mary Pope Osborne and just hearing how much, for these children's stories, they just like grab them and they come up over and over again. And I think that's amazing. But what's interesting is I know, at least for the friends of mine who are writing books for the first time, they've spent years and years and years, and they're still in their first book trying to get it out, and like work on it because they want it to be good and they want it. And it seems like a stressful process to me, but they just really believe in what they're doing, and so they're creating this book. And so I find it interesting to me that when you say that you love it, but it's not something that is just flowing quickly all the time. It's almost like I don't know, it sounds almost like a discipline, but a discipline upon which you've like committed to and you love. And so you work through it. But I feel like that's such a different perspective because typically you hear it just kind of goes and flows out, and then you have it. You know you have a talent. Um, so I guess, yeah, how do you, that's so interesting because typically it's not, I guess maybe it's more famous authors who seem to give that impression, whether they mean to or not. But it's interesting how you say, like, when you set your mind to it, it's like a task, it's a discipline, it's something you put your heart into, but it's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite things, like, so I'm very much, I guess, a creature of habit, and I love routines, and I love books I love, I read over and over again.
Hmm.
Uh, there's this idea that you have to read really widely to be a writer, and I believe that, but it's not the only belief I have, is in that you can read narrowly as well. And that's how I became a writer, was knowing what I loved and obsessing over those books. And those books really taught me how I wanted to write in my own way. And it's interesting because you talk about, I think it's obviously different for everybody. And one of the favorite things I watch regularly, whether it's every year or every 2 years, there's a documentary about U2 making Achtung Baby, called From the Sky Down,
Hmm.
and they actually talk about it as if every project they've ever, every album has always gone right down to the wire, and that they would mistrust it if it came too easily. So that's again that, and I'm obviously not comparing myself to something of that magnitude, but I really associated with that, in that sense of they really they kind of enjoy the struggle of it. And again, I don't want to make writing sound like, again, and I like the way you talked about it, as in it's a discipline and it's difficult for me, but I still love it. uh, there's that idea of the
Yeah.
writer, well, the extreme idea of the writer who's in the garret starving, and every word is this huge task. And there's a great Australian playwright called David Williamson, And he's quite, and I remember watching the extras of a DVD. This is something of my generation, of the DVDs and the extras, and he talks about writing in this way, where he says, "Oh, there are these writers, and they say every word is like a drop of blood on the page," and then he just laughs and he says, "It's bullshit. You do it because you love it." And I definitely feel that way, but I like the idea that if it was easy, everybody would do it, and yeah, and sometimes it is a real struggle, but it's also a joy in those moments, but then especially so when it kind of like things part a little bit. And
Hmm.
the way I liken it is, I remember as a kid having to go on these sort of hikes with my dad, and my siblings, and it'd be really difficult at the beginning. And my dad would say, "Yeah, but it'll all be worth it." And so the way I think of writing is, it's like climbing a mountain, but there's the promise of a sand pit or a sandbox at the top, or a playground where you get to play. And so what happens is, I find getting to my desk is the hardest part, and I might have days that it's not really working. And then sometimes you just write a sentence or a phrase or an image, and it's that sort of image that it doesn't even necessarily make sense on the surface. And the book thief is full of these sorts of phrases or images where it might not even make sense, or it's a bit off center, but it kind of works, or hopefully works in some way underneath, or there's a meaning in it that I'm not even quite sure of what it is, but it's somehow there. And so I like accessing that part of our imagination where something that is sort of imaginative or not necessarily quite right works because it just feels right and it gives you a feeling. And so when you read it, you're seeing the world in a way that you haven't quite experienced, but you somehow understand it. And that's what they say. All novels or all films, of imagination should do. That you're giving the reader something that is not their world, but they bring themselves to it and can understand it. And I guess that sounds kind of complicated, but it's not. It's just you're trying to do something that you're trying to put yourself onto the page in a
Hmm.
way that people will understand and find themselves in that. And it can be tricky, but that's also a great joy. And even as I'm talking about it, I feel myself light up, when I talk about stories and accessing imagination in that way.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I personally believe that an offer is a medium by which beauty is being created, right? So beauty exists in the world. Storytelling, I think, is one of the most beautiful ways humanity connects with each other because it's how we can express in words experiences, and we can create pictures that people may never get to see or never experience, but they can read about it. And somehow that helps them to see or understand something. That's why it's so important. And I think if an offer is a medium of doing something where they're trying to bring a beauty of some kind to the attention of the reader, it takes time and focus and work. And the style of how it's done, is so different for each offer. But at the same time, I do think it takes work. And if you want to make something beautiful, you do have to work it. If I just put out the podcasts, when I first started this, I used to just put them out and I didn't even, and granted, I was new at it, and I was still learning. But at the same time, like for me, I kept thinking about all that mattered was the quantity, not the quality.
Mm-hmm.
But as time would go on, I'd start listening to them myself and I'm going, I'm just not liking this. Like my questions sound way too scripted. I'm not giving the person enough time to respond. I'm not okay with silence. If maybe they needed 10 seconds and they weren't done with their thought, but they were kind of thinking for a second, but I didn't like it, so I wanted to skip ahead, or however it is, or even doing some editing to make it simpler and easier for people to understand. But that takes a little more work. And if I really care about it and if I really want beauty to come out of something, I'm going to put the work in. Because I have to admit to you, I have read books which the ideas have been good. They really have. But the person I don't know. Maybe they didn't, and you could disagree with me on this because I know people think differently about what beauty means and so forth. But it didn't seem like they had put tons of thought into how the reader was going to read it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, maybe you thought of all these great ideas, but you threw them at me. I'm reading it, but this is a very unpleasant read. Like I'm just, um it's not telling me as much about your process. Like you didn't seem to care too much about the process. Like maybe I'm getting what you're trying to say, but this isn't a beautiful piece of work. It's jumbled, it's meaningful, but I had to dig and I finally got something out of it. So it meant something, but it wasn't something I'm gonna read again. And I think that's one of some of the beauties of books you read again is because you love them. They're beautiful. There's like you go back and there's a new truth you find every time you read it. And so I don't know for you if that is something you've thought about, but like, oh, I feel like to wrestle beauty into existence, sometimes it does take a lot of hard work and it's something you have to be very actually focused on as opposed to just, well, if I just do this, it'll happen by itself.
Yeah, well, the way like I'll often talk about editing with people, and so or even when edits come to me and someone will suggest something be taken out, and a lot of the time the first thing I'll come into that saying, well, there was a deliberate reason I wrote it like that,
Yeah.
and especially so if it's an unusual usage of language or whatever it is,
Hmm.
and the other thing too is, and to your point about just throwing it down is, I mean, yeah, you want to have freedom when you write, but then at the same time, at some point I'll look at something and I'll say, if I change that word at the top of the page, I'll probably have to, like, I'll reread the whole page again because it affects everything else on that page. It
Hmm.
is like a domino effect, and so it's like that idea of, you know, of of everything being in its right place and everything fits, and so, or everything being balanced, or it's sort of like every page is like a seesaw, and you're just trying to get it to be balanced all the time. And as soon as you change one thing, it changes the
Yeah.
scales way. And so you're trying to make the picture whole all the time, and yet at the same time, I don't want to give people the impression that, that I think I'm some kind of artist or something. To me, I'm a tradesman, and that is maybe in pursuit of an art form, and
Hmm.
I'm just working away and working away, like a stonemason or something, trying to get everything to fit properly and to fit in a way that, at the end of the day, it's a really simple thing. What I'm trying to do is put black words on a white page and have you see it in color and to have you believe it. And
Hmm.
that's what made me want to be a writer in the first place. And so, to anybody listening who's thinking, oh God, this is all sounding really hard. Yeah, it is, depending on how far you're willing to go. But the actual premise is quite beautiful and simple in that you
Hmm.
just make things up. It's like a magic act. And so rather than going to see magicians pull a rabbit out of a hat or to do, or, to have, crazy things happen. Uh, it's me just trying to write something and make something up and have you believe it, and to do it well enough, and to have all of those building blocks of words as they are in place to have you feel like you're there. And that's my only. At the end of the day, you can make it as complicated and tough, and I know that I've done that. But it's just sort of like, no, no, just simplify it, just demystify the idea of it, and just have it be okay. Just put the work in so that I believe it when I'm writing it, and then I believe it when I'm rereading it, and then everything else you're doing is just adjusting to make that experience all the more real, to be what you're talking about, where when you're reading, you feel like you're reading something put together. You're reading something that's whole, not just fragments of things that are all just in places. But every book has a different. There might be a book that, where you're reading it and it is quite off the cuff, and that's the idea of it. So there are so many more ways to do this job, and that's what makes it both liberating but also tricky,
Yeah.
because it's hard to get everything right, and you've just got to be so much yourself, that you feel like you're writing a book that nobody else could have written. You know, forget about how good it is or if it's the greatest book or the worst book. It just has to be a book that only you could have written. It is the way I look at it. I'm not telling other people how they should do it, but that's what's worked for me, and possibly hindered me. So again, you're just trying to find the happiest way for you to do
Well, do you, when can you
it.
come to peace with your mind that this is good enough? Because, like you said, I mean, anything could be worked on for years and decades and decades and decades and maybe possibly get better and better and better. But when for you do you have to go, okay, I think this is done. Maybe it's not the ideal in my mind, but I have to be satisfied with it. Like, do you ever do that to kind of cut yourself off at some point, or?
Yeah, well, you have to because otherwise you'll just, you know, you'll probably go insane by the end.
Yeah.
There's a line, and there's a line. It's sort of like Neil Young is one of my heroes, and there are certain songs you hear where you hear a mistake in it, or you hear that his voice just dropped or did something, and you can tell that then they've listened to it and they've gone, "Do you want to have another go at that?" And he said, and he's probably said, "Yeah, I know there's a flaw there, but I kind of like it's beautiful because it's got that in it." Uh, and and so I like this idea that you can make something more correct, but that doesn't make it necessarily more right.
Hmm.
And so sometimes, and the way I look at it too as well is sometimes you'll go in and you'll go to fix something, and then what comes back, and when you reread it again, is you realize you made a new mistake. And so I think there's a point where you realize that, okay, I can keep working on this, but I'm going to start hurting it more than I'm helping it. And
Hmm.
so I think what you want at the end of the day is, and through all like the seven books that I've put out, if I look at a book like the one and I realize it's because of that book that we're talking to each other, and that, that people know me is because of the book thief. That's the kind of book that, you know, it was a tremendous effort to write that book, but it may come across as feeling effortless. And so I think that's also what if people can feel the hard work that's gone into it, uh, that's also because I know the book I wrote after the book, The Bridge of Clay, which in a lot of ways is a better book, but I think you can feel the effort that went into that book. And that's a very different reading experience where I think where you watch someone struggling to do something, you start to get tired yourself. And
Yeah.
it suited the characters of that book and very different book in that way. But, you know, it's okay to fail as well, or it's okay to have something that's, that maybe didn't work quite as well or that people didn't respond to because, it just has to be what it is. And so, the people who do love that book, they're almost in this other kind of club where it's sort of like, and I'll look at them and I'll say, I'm glad you love that book. That's not a book for weaklings. It's not Ulysses, but it just brings, some people like the idea of that they had to work a bit harder for that book and to access what that book was going to give them. And I think this is the other thing that you have to remember, or that I have to remember as a writer, is that your readers actually owe you nothing. Uh, and that you're writing the book, or for me, I end up writing the book actually, and I don't want this to sound too whimsical, but I'm writing it for the people in the book. I'm writing my book for the characters in it because they're real to me when I'm writing it. And
Yeah.
so my service is actually to them to get them right.
Can I ask, I know the book thief is the one that a lot of people talk about, and I know that's kind of, that's what you're known for greatly, is the book thief, and that's, you had a film made that ended up being made on it and all these things. Um, but I think what I always found so um, impactful about it is the fact that obviously the narrator is a deaf, or the angel of death, or just, giving him even a name. He's deaf, but also he seems to serve something as he's doing what he's doing and has fought and all of this. And it was, what it was, this grappling of like the innocence in your book of these children, and how like the protagonist of the book is a child, and the innocence of childhood, and then coming and confronting with death in this background in this dark way. But I guess, at least for me and in my experience of childhood, and the more I think we're going on and life is going, more and more children are experiencing the touch of death faster in their childhood, whether it be someone's actually died or just there's a lot of sadness they have to grapple with. And so it comes into their childhood like a wind really fast. And then all of a sudden they start to understand it, or that even for some becomes more comforting than life and like joy and happy things. And I think that's one thing that struck me about the book, is that I hadn't come across too many books where you were confronting the innocence of youth with this terrible truth, but most children in an ideal world don't have to face for quite a while. And those were blending very quickly early on. And so I know you mentioned somewhere in an interview or something, you were talking about how, your thoughts change in life as well as you write. And so what you might write at the beginning of your writing journey is not what you may write 20 years or 50 years later, or the thought may not even occur to you. And so I wondered, like, how much of that book and the heart of it, like, how have you come to see life? Has it changed for you at all since you wrote The Book Thief? Like, is there aspects of that book that when you read back now, like, you may really enjoy reading, but it's not something that maybe your view on something has changed, or it's not the way you would paint it now if you were to write a book again? Like, has that happened for The Book Thief in particular? Was there anything in that book that has changed for you as time has gone on?
Well, when it first came out and it started to get an audience, and it still happens to me now, is because of kind of the portrayal of death that I chose to use, where he's kind of sympathetic to humans,
Mm-hmm.
and he's kind of like the missing piece of us. And people would say to me, thanks to you, I'm not afraid of dying anymore. And I used to laugh and make light of that and say, I'm really happy for you, because I'm still pretty afraid of dying, even though I guess like, and I guess there's a kind of a nice testament to this idea that they were there in the book and that they believed me. They believed what they were reading. And I think that's been the biggest change for me, is that I've sort of come around more to them, and to be a bit less afraid. And I think, I mean but that doesn't mean if death was to appear in front of me now that I wouldn't be afraid. And so I think, but I think more so I try to remember what I was like a little bit when I wrote that book, and I
Hmm.
think I've become more afraid of writing, and being a writer, than when I was back then. So I think probably when I wrote The Book Thief, as I sort of spoke a bit earlier, I was right in that sweet spot of knowing how to do it, but still not as capable or experienced as I thought I was. And
Yeah.
so I think that really set me free. And so it's more, I think the lesson I look back on now with writing that book is that, so I still will read it and go, oh, I went too far in that bit, or I went too far with that image, or oh, just that bit. Oh, I wish I could just have my time again to write that. But I think what you learn, I think, as you get, older as well, or more experienced, is that you write. There's a reason you write your next book, and one of the biggest reasons to write your next book is to atone for the sins of the last one. And so it's a good thing to look back and cringe a little bit at certain things that you did or decisions you made. And I think with The Book Thief, I look back now and I say, it's okay to have those things that I wish I could change. It's probably good that they're there and that they can't be changed. because it was probably better to go too far with that book in its ideas than to not go far enough. And so I'm
Hmm.
kind of okay with it. And I think as a whole, I think when you read that book, or if I was to just pick up bits and pieces, I can feel the joy that went into writing it, even though it's set in a bleak time and it has
Oh yeah.
a supposedly bleak narrator. But the fact that it came through the eyes of children was just that, purely because my parents told me stories of being kids in that time, in that place, and it was from there that I had the original ideas that then set me off into this world of imagination to write about it as well. And I wasn't trying to make any great claims on history, or telling anyone anything new about that period of time, whether it's
Yeah.
Nazi Germany or anything else. It was just trying to write, uh, hopefully a great story with memorable characters in it, and to have people believe it while they were reading it, and that's so. I try to keep the ambitions great in a way, but also humble at the same time. Is just to try to do something great, but achieve something simple, I suppose, and have people believe it, and hopefully then be moved by it while they're reading it. And because that to me is what I've loved about being a reader, is that you have this experience with a book that makes you feel extra alive, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to get to.
Can I ask, you know, the thing that's one thing that stuck out to me was how many times the protagonist had nightmares, like all every night, because of what had happened with her brother on the train, and obviously it's very traumatic for her. But I wondered, like, I don't know, it was very realistic that if you went through something, she would, wake up and have these terrible nightmares, and like she had all these body reactions to what she had gone through. And obviously you have like this understanding older man who will come and sit by her and read to her. And um but like, did you know that automatically, that I don't know, because for me, like, I've gone through some very hard things in my life, and so body responses are very familiar, and they almost become a second character in my life many times. And when I'm reading a book, it's either overdone or it's not done at all. It's like something terrible just happened, and then this person like goes through their life with no body reactions at all. Like that part of anything isn't focused on. And I wondered, I mean, I know you mentioned you were a young writer at the time, but I thought it was very insightful, and I didn't know like how you would know that beyond having experienced it or your parents telling you or something, because I had just never come across a book that was very honest with a portrayal of these bodily responses to these horrific things that she had gone through, like waking up every night with nightmares. Maybe in a book it's once in a while, but like for her it was almost like this repeated thing for quite some time. And that's accurate. That would happen. And so I wondered where you got that from. Like it was very real to me.
Yeah, I think I don't know. There are some things you don't second guess. And
Huh.
like, so, for example, sometimes people say to me, "You'd written full books before this with male protagonists, and then this one had a female protagonist. Did you ever consider having Liesl, the main character, as a boy?" And I didn't even think of that. Like, not for 1 second did I think that it should be a boy and a male character. And I think that's just because my mum had told me stories about growing up outside of Munich. My dad had told me stories about growing up outside of Vienna, but it was always her story in my mind. And then it ceases to be her story the moment you make something up about that character,
Hmm.
it becomes them,
Hmm.
they become themselves. And with the nightmares, so I remember on my mum and dad's 25th wedding anniversary, I was 9 years old. And I was the youngest of four siblings, and so there was all the party going on in this outside, and but the teenagers, so that little extra bit older than me, and my oldest sister was 7 years older than me, so that makes her 16, and they were watching The Exorcist, in
Oh,
our room.
wow.
And and I went in there and I was 9 years old, and of course I was terrified
Oh, yeah.
by what I saw. And that's very different, obviously, and pretty easy life compared to what happens to Liesel in the book Thief. But at the start of the book, where her brother dies on the train, and but what I remember is every night or every day, I would be sitting in my fourth grade classroom, so grateful that it was 9:30 in the morning, so
Oh,
grateful that it was 11, so grateful that it was still only 2 o'clock, so great. And then as night came closer and closer, I was just getting close, and I'd go to bed, and because all I could see was and the scenes, the famous scenes from The Exorcist, and
oh.
I just couldn't go to sleep. Yeah, for
Oh,
probably months and months, and so maybe that's why things like like the idea of Liesel having these recurring nightmares, why why that's included, because you have all of these, we have all this DNA embedded in us, but we just have little moments from our lives that
yeah.
are also embedded into our overarching story, and so that idea of recurring nightmares probably just comes from that. The same way that in like another in Bridge of Clay, there's the usage of a peg or a clothespin as a symbol, and that comes from a very just like not such a big moment, but I remember my brother and I playing cricket, so sort of the Australian equivalent of baseball in our backyard, and us hitting the ball once, and it hit my mum in the stomach while she was hanging something on the clothesline, just her towel from her shower, because on the clothesline, and all the pegs from the peg basket fell on the ground. And for whatever reason, just that little moment stuck with me, so that I don't know how, it's just always been there. And then I ended
Hmm.
up using a clothespin or a peg in a novel that I wrote because it was such a clear moment, or such a clear image. And so just even the smallest thing, well, it didn't feel so small when she yelled, you know, yelled at
Sure.
the ball, and also feeling sorry. Oh, so sorry we hit you with the ball. But all of those little things, they're almost like our creative DNA, that we're assembling as we go along. And then what happens in a book is, and in the case of Lisa with her nightmares, then the character of Max comes, and
Mhm,
he's hiding in her basement, and he also has nightmares. And so,
mhm,
and this is the thing, is that I had one of the big challenges of that book was you had two characters very disparate coming together, and I needed them to bond, and them bonding over the fact that they have nightmares was one thing, and also the other thing was he wrote her a picture book for her to read, and that actually talks about the nightmares
mhm.
that they each have, and there's a picture in there of her nightmare, which is in her case, and it's drawn as a small boy crawling into her bed as she
Uh-huh.
sleeps. The nightmare of her remembering her brother dying, and in his case, it's his family being kind of standing almost in like a portrait shot, with Hitler standing in the middle with his arms around some of them, and
Yeah.
and so it's just that way of, and again what you're talking about, of taking ideas and then working on them so that they become a full idea, or
Mhm.
a truly creative idea. And so it wasn't just, it wasn't, so rather than having a soldier coming in and dragging Max's family away, just that idea of Hitler standing there with his arms sort of lovingly around them, to me, that was a more potent way of uh, kind of painting that particular picture. So I'm always, I guess, looking for ways to make characters connect, but also in a way that feels unexpected to the reader as well, but also true,
Yeah.
and a natural way. And so it's just always, you're just always trying to find a way to connect with someone in a way that opens their eyes and surprises them as well.
Well, I love how you get. I mean, Max to me was someone who had lost the innocence because he was so young. But he had
Mm.
lost his innocence of childhood because of all that had happened, and he had dreams, and he still had them, but he was so doubtful that those dreams would ever come true. But then you had Liesel, who was beginning to dream because she had come to a family that could at least love and care for her and give her some healing from what had happened before. But then, she's already been tainted by loss. And it was just so interesting how those two come together, and with the nightmares and everything. It was just very real, and you gave a child like Liesel, young person, this whole life and this whole world. And that's one reason why I love children's literature, and I'm so grateful to the friends who have encouraged me to read it over the years. Because at first I was like, no, I read adult books, and I had so many people say, no, 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 you should try reading children's literature. I'm like, but I'm not a kid anymore. And they're like, no, you don't understand. Like, we're all still children. You'll read it and it'll still matter. And I remember reading my first children's novel a couple years ago as an adult, and I cried because the kid just wanted home at the end of the book. And I thought to myself, that's what I want. I want home. And like, there was just, children don't beat around the bush. They just tell you, that's what I mean. That's what I desire. That's what I want. That's what I need. Whereas with adults, we just get really good at covering up everything that we need. And so we seem really put together and everything in life is going well. But with children, they're just very real. They're honest. And they're like, they scream when they're scared. They're crying when they're, sad. They're laughing hysterically when they're happy. Like, they just don't have that. And I think with, that book, and I don't mean to harp on it because I know you've heard so much about it, but that was just, all these things for me were so touching. Because especially for children, for me as a child, when you didn't get to have that moment or get to express and see all that loss, and then when you can see yourself and that representation of getting to have that story and that loss, and being able to have a world that is dedicated to a child like that. I mean, it's just really touching, and thought provoking. But um, I I was thinking, you mentioned earlier about the being an author, and then you said there is something I wanted to ask you about that. You were talking about, what were you saying before I blabbled on just now? You were talking about um, characters and how you wanted them to connect from nightmares. And you said something else. Oh, it'll have to come back to me.
It might have, maybe I can help. Sometimes it's easier to think about something else. But what was that first children's book that you read?
As an adult, it was called, I hope this doesn't sound embarrassing. It was called Snicker of Magic.
Okay, that sounds great.
It
Great
was
title.
it was about a little girl, a little kid who whose parent was in prison, and her mother, her sister, and her were separated in foster care. And
Okay.
she went to go live with someone in this really fun town with these really quirky people that really did funny things. And she always wanted her sister to come back because her sister had promised she would come back. But she never came back, um, because she had left and she had failed her promise. But this little kid just wanted home, all the people she'd missed to come back and make home for her. And in the end, some people come back, but it's also a lot of the people in the community that become her home. And she realizes that home is the people that love you, even if it's not the people you thought would love you.
Hmm.
So the people who love you well, but not necessarily the people that um, are supposed to be the ones that love you. So it's like a hard truth, because you want these specific people to, but they don't. They fail. And so that
Mm.
was just, it was so sweet. Now you were just crying because, I mean, I was. If my husband probably saw me, he didn't see me at the time crying, but he probably been like, he would be like, I'm so glad you like those books, but it wasn't for him. um, but it just, yeah, it's beautiful that um, representation of children, and that's one thing I loved about the Book Thief too. Um, but actually, that leads me to a question. Did you, I know you were 16, I think you say in your bio when you decided you wanted to write.
Hmm.
But it sounds like you had a very sensitive storytelling mind before that because you remember things very vividly from when you were a kid. Is there, like, when you were young, is there a story or a book you really liked that maybe you would even read now?
Oh, well, I reread all my favorite books from all time, and I'm always unabashedly been an S.E. Hinton fan, and the book of hers I read over and over or come back to is Rumblefish, which is not, and so it's such that interesting thing where when you know an author's work really well, it's often you don't love the book that everyone else loves. Not which is not to
Yeah,
say
that's true.
and it's not to say I don't love The Outsiders, but I think Rumblefish is actually her masterpiece, and it's the one that I really, it's the one I think that is the most thought provoking, and it doesn't have her most lovable characters in it, but it's a truly great book, I think, and uh, and it's sort of, and I think that's one that really ignited this idea that no, you just got to do it the way you have to do it, and you have to try, and finding that way, that's actually the really hard thing, because the easiest way to do it is to just do what you've learned from other people.
Hmm.
Because it's sort of like, you may, I don't know if you were ever in school, you remember, I just remember being in high school and you had to write something for a creative task, and then you write something and then you're halfway through the first page and you go, oh, this is just like that episode of The Simpsons.
Yeah. It's fan fiction.
Just like a great movie that I just saw, because
Yeah.
that's all sitting at the top of your head. That's all that's been given to you. But your original ideas, the ideas you haven't had yet, are all buried underneath that. So your originality is buried underneath all of the great ideas that you've been given. And your job as a writer or to do anything creative is to dig through those, dig through everything you've learned to find a way to achieve that, but with your own ideas. And I'm still trying to do that to this day, and to do it in a way that makes it totally yours, as I was talking about earlier, where you unlock something and you go, oh, that's totally me in a way, or that's totally a way that I love doing it, that I feel like is mine. And so, like with a book like The Book Thief, that's what that's the way I feel about it. Is I sort of think, yeah, I'm not saying it's the greatest book. There are so many better books than that, but I know that no one else could have written it. And you sort of go, that has to be enough at some point.
Are there certain things that you think are too deep or too painful to be written in actual language as opposed to, like, because I know you mentioned Hitler hugging the family members, and anyone who's reading, your imagination, of course, is going to start thinking, oh, okay, something bad happened to his family. You can, and then your mind will create whatever that was,
Mm,
concentration camp, whatever you want to think about. And, but you didn't specifically go into tons of detail about what exactly happened.
mm,
It was very heavily implied, but what you weren't quite completely, you didn't have a path that was specifically given you to go on and then look at all of the parts. And so I wondered, because I was talking to a filmmaker the other day and he told me there were specific things he won't film because he thinks it's quite enough if you imply it. And then
yeah,
everyone else will, your audience has enough dignity and respect of their own to create the rest of the picture, making
yeah.
it more powerful than you could have done. And so I wonder, for writing, is there any subject matter? Is there anything in particular where you don't cross the boundary there because you think people can go there themselves?
Yeah, I don't actually necessarily think of. myself as a risque writer or anything. And although I think just on what you're talking about there with like in a lot of ways it's easier to be graphic.
Yeah,
It,
it
yeah,
is.
because
Yeah.
there's an idea of like a restraint is actually more difficult. And to be graphic is that and so there's that idea that it's easy to get a response by being
Uh-huh.
extreme. And and I agree with that filmmaker in that like take people to the brink and let them fill it in, and in that way you're giving the audience or the reader, and in the case of a book, you're getting them to do that next bit of work. And actually, that's what's kind of beautiful about when a book ends and or a movie ends, and you take the characters into their future yourself. Uh,
Yes, yeah.
you hope that things worked out, or you wonder if they're going to be happy, or you want. And so, I kind of like that idea of that you want to give the reader enough so they feel what they need to feel, but but not so much that everything is done for them. And then because then they feel overly manipulated, or then they feel like it's just like remember being a kid and your parents trying to do so, or someone trying to do too much for you. I mean, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So I guess it's our job to try to take people, and not in a sense of feeling responsible for a deep issue or a hard issue or anything, but to feel responsible as the person creating the work, so that the person who's receiving it gets out of it and can do with it what they need to do to get the most out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think I've had to learn that though over the years too, because you're right, it's very easy because I don't know, as humans we love like gritty details sometimes. We're like get really excited and we're like, ooh, this is really, really interesting. And then afterwards we feel super dirty, whether it's because it was a ton of violence or a ton of whatever, and we're like, actually I would have been better served not seeing all of that, but I did really want to in the moment. Um but just as a last question, because I want to be respectful of your time, do you do you say your identity is in writing? Because I've met some authors who don't know what they would be like without doing the writing. And then I've met some artists who said that they've never been proud of anything they've done, even things that have become super well known that people love and quote over and over and over again, but they're not proud of it because they just. I had one lady I talked to who said, I know what I do, but I don't know what I am. Um, and I just wondered for you, like, if you didn't write, or if writing became, as you said, it actually has become harder over the years, not because you're going to stop, but maybe it's just a phase, whatever it is. Um, do you have an identity beyond the writing, or do you find that the writing really grounds who you are as a person?
I think it's a line or a bridge that I kind of walk, and I I know that, and I think there's a real difference between being a writer and being having this I and as in being a writer in that you write, and then being a writer for the sake of being a writer, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
an identity or a place card or like a business card saying I'm a writer. Like and when I say business card, I just mean as in that's how people view you.
Hmm.
And I don't necessarily, and that's the part I don't. I know that the way that I should be most useful in the world, or useful to myself and to my family and to my surroundings, is to be a writer, and because that's when I'm at my best and I'm at my happiest, and it's best described like this when people say, "Oh, geez, you must procrastinate a lot. You must mow the lawn and vacuum the house," just to, and what I say to them is actually I do all of those chores and all of those things better when I'm writing well. And
Hmm.
so writing makes me feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But I could walk away from the idea of being a writer, so to speak, as in viewed from the rest of the world, where you get some sort of, whether it's not notoriety, but just that kind of, that pat on the back of being a writer, being, I think I could easily, I don't really need to have that validation, I suppose, of being a success. And I guess it's that idea of being successful, but I don't want to be, I shouldn't be glib about that either, because I know that I'm one of the lucky ones and I've got to make a living out of writing, and I've got to travel the world because of writing. And so I'm hugely, I think that's the idea. And it's a bit of a cliche, is that, and you'll hear sports people talk about it like this, where they'll say, you know, like pick any sport. Let's say, well, let's just use one down here. Like, there are two kinds of rugby. There's rugby union and there's rugby league. Okay, and someone will say, you know, rugby league owes me nothing, but I owe rugby league everything. And
Mm.
that's how I feel about writing. Is that writing's given me so much, and I wouldn't be who I am without it. And that I get to sit down and make stuff up. I mean, that's a dream job. And it's also a dream job at the times when it's not easy, and when I really, because you have to have just an extra bit of super belief in yourself that you could write something that somebody else would want to read. You have to have that kind of faith in yourself. And so I think I'm always treading a line between, doubt and faith in myself, and this idea that I can actually do it. But that's what, you don't want to wake up as me in the first couple of minutes of every day where I just go, oh, what was I thinking? What was I thinking that I could be a writer? I'm not any good at this. And then you have to sort of like light the fires of belief in yourself to get to do it. But I like the idea that it's not easy. And I like the fact that, I've got to sometimes force myself to turn up, because I think we all have an element of that in our lives, in everything that we do. And writing is just, my path through it, and the way I get through the world, I suppose, and find the thing that I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Um, not only as, my job and how I contribute to the world and to my family, but how I contribute, to myself in that way, to feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And it comes back to that idea of waking up and going to work, and doing the trade, and hopefully at the end of it having more than 7 books to my name.
I love that you list the books you didn't publish. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, well, they're important. They're important.
They
It's
are,
important.
yeah.
Yeah, because it's the books you don't finish, or the ones that you don't, that never get finished, or, it's all your failures. They're the foundation to what, they're all that's all the hard work that's holding up what works into the light. And so you don't get the wins without those losses. That's for sure.
But I'm also really glad to hear, in a way, I don't like, obviously, that it makes you feel the struggle, but there's a humility to that too, because I've met so many authors who I think are very confident in what they do, to the point where they don't worry about it anymore. And
Mm,
I don't want to say that's a bad thing necessarily, but there also isn't the humility of like coming up with an idea, because it
mm.
just happens. And I think if you can remain a writer with humility, then you probably might tell better stories. That's just my opinion, though. I don't know. But
Well, I'm with you, because it's that all the writers who I love, and the ones who are my friends, and the ones who I've connected with, whether it's, through their books or outside of books, they're usually the ones. It's never the one who says, "I've just finished my last book. It's the best one yet." It's usually the author who goes, "Oh, I don't know what to do. I'm writing this book. It's never going to work." Yeah, they're my good friends, and they're the ones whose work I end up respecting the most, because not because they seem slightly depressive. They're not. It's more just
yeah.
usually quite funny about that, and it's just that it's that those mysteries of how to get it to work, and
hmm
not knowing you can do it. That, to me, I think produces better work, and much in the way that you're saying. So I think we're definitely, found the right level, with each other there, which I really like.
Well, thanks so much again for doing this. This has just been really, I mean, it's an honor for me. I love your work. And it's just been really great to get to connect with you and know more about you. And I do hope that the rest of your season goes well, and that whatever new book you come out with eventually, be excited to read it.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and really thoughtful, and I've really appreciated that. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. Well, have a good morning, afternoon, and I'm gonna head out, start getting ready for bed.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and thanks for fitting me in just now. When I know, you could have said no, it's got to be later in the year. So that's a big help too.
I was not gonna say no. I would cancel my plans.
Thank you,
All right,
and all
bye.
the best. Yeah, have a great night, and to your husband as well.